My name is Amin Moradam, Associate Research at the Center, and on behalf of the Center, we are delighted today to host the first talk of our talk series on the very, I would say, hot topic of Iran-Saudi relation by our guest speaker, Dr. Banafsheh Keynoush. The talk is titled, as we have seen before, Saudi Arabia and Iran, Building Understanding for Improved Ties. Dr. Banafsheh Keynoush is an international geopolitical consultant, foreign affairs scholar, and the author of Saudi Arabia and Iran, Friends or Foes. Dr. Keynoush has extensive background working with members of the press and has interacted closely with major U.S. media outlets, including CNN, NBC, Fox, and public television. She has worked in the field of international development with the World Bank, the Asia Foundation, and the Swiss Academy for Development, in addition to volunteering work to the United Nations Political Department and United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. Dr. Keynoush has served as policy advisor to multiple international non-governmental organizations in Washington, Tehran, and Geneva. Previously an assistant and adjunct professor for over 13 years teaching Middle East politics, she also served as an accredited English-Persian simultaneous interpreter with the European Commission. For 2 decades, Dr. Keynoush worked as a freelance interpreter and translator at the United Nations, the International Labor Organization, the UN Human Rights Commission, the U.S.-Iran Claims Tribunal in dual-track diplomatic initiatives with multiple international news outlets, and with the 4 of Iran's presidents and Nobel laureate. She was also being the interpreter. She obtained her master's and PhD degrees in international relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and holds a second master's degree in applied linguistics. Just before starting, so the talk is going to be moderated by Professor Cyrus Shayekh, that I'm sure most of you know, who is a professor at the Near Eastern Studies. And one more information about the talk. So I wanted just to thank also our sponsor, the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies, Pierce at Princeton. And one more information, the talk is going to be recorded and it's going to be online on our website, which is then, so it's princeton.edu/Iran. Thank you very much and enjoy the talk. Dr. Keynoush, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Princeton University, Princeton International Institute for Regional and International Studies, the Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for hosting me. And I also want to thank Dr. Halden, Rose Wellman, Dr. Cyrus Shayekh, Dr. Moradam. I can't think of any 2 countries in the world that have as bad a relation as Saudi Arabia and Iran at this present juncture of time. And I'd like to actually emphasize that the relations are particularly bad between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran. So you may have noticed that not only are their relations persistently bad, but I'm also stubbornly insistent on using the full titles of these 2 states' relations to draw a distinction between where they are today and where they were in the past prior to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when the 2 actually did enjoy periods of relative calm in their relationship. As a matter of fact, I also want to insist stubbornly again that I can't think of any two countries in the world whose relations are also as misunderstood as that between Saudi Arabia, again, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Oftentimes, the tensions between them are attributed to religious differences and discords. And as a matter of fact, when you look at their history, religion was always a driver in their foreign policy behavior, but it was not a key motive of their relationship. And religion often did take a backstage, in fact, in much of the history of their mutual relations. And the two states had a very particular incentive in curbing religion. This goes back to as early as the rise of the Wahhabi trend in the Arabian Peninsula. For those of you who may be historians, you would know that when the first and second Saudi realms emerged in the 18th century and 19th century, militant Wahhabism was actually a key factor in the fall of those two realms. And as a result of that, the Al Saud that now presently has established the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is very keenly aware of the need to curb that sort of militancy. And the Wahhabi trend has gone through various periods of revival, in fact, serving the nation state of Saudi Arabia. So when you look again back in history and compare the formation of statehood in Persia and in Saudi Arabia, it is fascinating that both of them went through very similar trends. Both did use religion to unify different forces within society, but the ultimate goal of the use of religion was to advance a nation state and to create a national identity. So I say this to emphasize that when I say that relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran are misunderstood, what I clearly aim to say is that religion is, again, a motivator, but not a key driver. And so the key question for me, particularly when I was writing the book, was that if religion is not really the driver of the tensions between them, then what can actually justify the immense tensions between them? The key question that I actually tried to address was, are the regional tensions a cause of are regional tensions in fact a symptom of a consequence of the Saudi-Iranian tensions, or is it the reverse, that regional tensions lead to the discord between Saudi Arabia and Iran? And I discovered that in fact it is the fact that regional tensions often exacerbate the fault lines that divide Saudi Arabia and Iran. So the tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran remain a symptom of those wider regional tensions, often exacerbated by foreign intervention. And you know that we are talking about a region, the Persian Gulf, where foreign intervention has been historic. The Portuguese were there, the British came in the 18th century, the Ottomans were there. And later on, to the present time, the United States has been a key player. The net result of this foreign penetration in the Persian Gulf has weakened the organic self-balancing features that bond Saudi Arabia and Iran in a very natural manner to one another. Again, if you look at their history, when they are left alone, they figure out what their strengths and weaknesses are, and they try to sort of advance their ties and their interests based on that. But once foreign intervention takes place, obviously their ability to adjust becomes harder for each of them, and it is in those circumstances when the fallback on the religious factor in order to solidify the power of the state becomes more eminent. So in a way, this is sort of a difficult dilemma for the West as well. On the one hand, we don't want these two states to fall back on religion in advancing foreign policy goals, say, in conflict zones at the present time, in Syria, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. But at the same time, we, as the foreign intervener, are enablers of that process. And lo and behold, what we have today is a state in both Saudi Arabia and Iran where their ability to address the conflicts in these countries is diminished significantly. And so we see a great deal of confusion in Syria, a great deal of confusion in Yemen, a great deal of confusion in Afghanistan, a great deal of confusion in Iraq. We also see a great deal of confusion in the conduct of U.S. foreign policy in the region. And I believe that this confusion will only continue, as we can see specifically in the case of Yemen and in the case of Syria, the multiple ceasefires that come into place and then are broken, the multiple times that Russia and the United States try to address the problems, try to even interact with all players in Syria and all interest holders in Yemen, but then the conflicts re-emerge in a more serious manner. So I want to take us back a little bit to history. In 1929, Saudi Arabia and Iran decided to establish a treaty of friendship. And Abdulaziz Al Saud, the founder of the Third Saudi realm and the modern kingdom of Saudi Arabia, actually reached out to Reza Shah and asked for Persia's endorsement of his new kingdom of Najd and Hijaz after he had successfully unified the large segments of the eastern and western peninsula. At the very same time, Abdulaziz had, through the use of an organized army called the Ikhwan, taken over the religious cities of Mecca and Medina. There was a siege placed on Jeddah, on the Red Sea. And what's interesting is that the natural bonds between Persia and the Arabian Peninsula were so powerful at that time. And here I want to touch base with some of the work done by Dr. Sirus Shayer, who has discussed trends such as transnational socio-spatial areas and arenas. You know, the organic way these two interacted with each other was so natural that Reza Shah, sitting back in Tehran, couldn't really understand what was going on in the Arabian Peninsula. And he saw the Al Saud, he had heard of them, but Persians had interacted with the predecessors of the Al Saud in Mecca and Medina, who were the Hashemite clan for centuries. And so he said, well, who are they? I mean, isn't the Arabian Peninsula just an extension of the Ottoman Empire? And then somebody called Habibullah Hoveyda, whose son later became an influential prime minister under the Shah in Iran, was an Arabist and by chance also a Baha'i, whose family had fled Persia due to the persecution of Baha'is by Shia theologians, came to Reza Shah and said, I'm an Arabist and I suggest that I should perhaps go and see what's going on. And Reza Shah said, well, of course, you are the eye of the nation, you are my Ain al-Mulk, and please go and find out what is going on. And by the way, the Shia clerics pressed Reza Shah to ask Abdulaziz to end the siege so that they could go and perform the Hajj. So you know the performance of the Hajj is a foundation of Islam, and for centuries. And I say this story just to, again, talk about the organic bonds, not the Shia and Sunni divide, but the organic bonds that connect these countries. So for centuries, these Shias were flowing from Persia, from Iraq, and trying to get to Mecca and Medina. And interestingly, many of them would frequent the Zubaydah route, which was built by Zubaydah, a wife of Harun al-Rashid, for those of you familiar with the history of Islam, somebody who also persecuted both Shias and Sunnis equally. So this is all a bit of an irony of history, but they interacted, and Habibullah Hoveyda did offer mediation, and Abdulaziz said, well, not until you recognized my kingdom first, which made a lot of sense. And in 1929, they finally established a treaty of friendship. The relationship between the two countries didn't pick up very immediately, except for these friendship bonds, really nurtured by Hoveyda. And that was due to the economic recession that was going on in the world just prior to World War II. After World War II, we see that the United States comes in as a more powerful force into the region. And not only does it enter the region, but it also develops a preferential relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which became a kingdom in 1932, versus Iran, which was always historically at odds with colonizing forces, Iran being, at the center of so many different trends in the region. It just permeated anti-colonialism, and although it wasn't colonized directly, it was significantly under the influence of British and Russians. And so, unlike Saudi Arabia, Persia really had a hard time with both the British and with the Americans. And so this preferential treatment between the West and Saudi Arabia emerged. And as a result, the balance of power that had organically created these transnational, as Dr. Shaikh says, transnational spatial connections began to weaken. And we see that in the 1950s when the Cold War was influencing the Middle East, when the Arab Cold War later emerged. The United States would at times either just develop that preferential treatment with Saudi Arabia, or tactically side with Iran in order to contain communist influences from the Soviet Union. So, for example, a pact emerged, the Baghdad Pact, in which Saudi Arabia was left out, but Iran was brought in just because of its proximity to the Soviet Union. This created a great deal of tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And again, back to the point of my work in this book, the balance of power kept shifting and weakening over time. In the 1960s, when the British decided that they eventually want to end the British protectorate in the Persian Gulf and grant independence to many of the southern Gulf states, we actually see that Saudi Arabia and Iran, again, try to work really hard at figuring out how to give Bahrain its independence, how to give the United Arab Emirates its independence. At that period, the British really wanted out, and they really didn't want to disturb the balance of power. But again, the United States did replace the British presence. And over time, certainly not during the Johnson administration, who was embroiled with the Vietnam War and had a more hands-off approach to the Persian Gulf, and therefore the balance of power was a little stronger. But by the time President Nixon assumed office and then an oil crisis hit in, if you remember the Arab war with Israel and the oil embargo tensions, and then later when President Gerald Ford came in, the United States decisively took sides with Saudi Arabia over time due to Iran's sort of hawkish oil policies. And that, too, may have in no small part ended the relative balance of power that had emerged in the 60s after the British withdrawal, and as we all know, led to the collapse of the Shah's government, the Shah's regime in Iran, and the emergence of the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Since the revolution, this balance of power has been tested multiple times. This is more recent history, so I won't delve deep into it. The Iran-Iraq War was one example in which Saudi Arabia reluctantly sided with Iraq. And again, I say reluctantly because that is the absolute truth. And Saudi Arabia had no interest in embroiling itself in Saddam's war with Iran, particularly because Saddam actually tried to frame this war as one between Shias and Sunnis. So here we are talking about the Shia and Sunni divide between Saudi Arabia, whereas just in recent history, some 30 years back, Saudi Arabia really didn't want to get into that realm. And it actually tried very hard to help Tehran establish a ceasefire. But Tehran would not accept those ceasefires because by that time the United States had become a major player. And as we know, after the end of the Iran-Iraq War, the United States formed a coalition leading to the Gulf War when Iraq invaded Kuwait. And Iran started seeing its battle in the Middle East not one between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but one with the United States, because ultimately the biggest threat seemed to the biggest threat to Tehran seemed to come from the United States. And so rather than building on those organic, self-balancing features that had historically bonded Riyadh and Tehran together, Tehran started thinking of ways to get even with the United States. And that in and by itself, you can imagine, creates a balance shift in a very difficult way. And it puts the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in a very difficult position because it has to figure out how to interact, how to balance its interdependent ties with the United States on the one hand, against, on the other hand, the frequent tensions in the US-Iranian relationship. And oftentimes we like to think, or maybe at times we have thought, that Saudi Arabia follows the US policy. We know that in recent years it's become less and less. But the fact is that historically, Saudi Arabia has never willingly followed the US policies. Saudi Arabia is a new nation state. Really, it was formed in its modern form in 1932 with a fledgling diplomacy, which is certainly not as strong as that of the United States or Iran. And it's in a very difficult position, trying to go along with allies such as the United States, but also restoring some of that balanced tie with Iran. So where does this lead us today? Unfortunately, it seems that as long as bigger powers, such as the United States and Russia, remain enablers of that divide that is emerging in the Saudi-Iranian relationship, we are looking at persistent and continuous wars of attrition in the region. The examples are plenty at this current stage. Again, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, just to name a few. I think that, sadly, in this process, the nature of military conflicts does take over some of the soft influences, soft power influences that can shape the region. And if you look at the statements issued by politicians these days, oftentimes it sounds more militaristic than more engaging. And when engagement does appear to be happening, it seems like a reluctant engagement, whereas we're looking at a region which had organically bonded together. For good or bad, it created itself for what it was. And so that soft power influence is being sidelined in favor of hard power military gains. The lack of, in my humble view, the lack of empathy in the conduct of foreign policy, especially by bigger powers, especially by the United States, towards the enemy, exacerbates the problems that we have in the region. Because without empathy for countries like Russia, for countries like Iran, we will really fail to grasp what they are about. And we will fail to predict their next move. And therefore, we will fail to curb that move when and if it works against US interests. And the lack of empathy has, needless to say, also led to tremendous humanitarian problem in the region. But what's fascinating to me is that, again, in order to justify our actions, we do tend, and the humanitarian aspect of the disaster in the Middle East is significant, and as a human rights lawyer, I in no way want to undermine that, but overinflating the humanitarian aspect of the issue and pointing fingers at Iran over its actions in Syria or at Saudi Arabia over its actions in Yemen will not do service to restoring and replenishing some of that lost self-balancing feature that is essential in bonding Saudi Arabia and Iran together. So it's not so much about you're bad or you're good or you're bad, and not of that, but what can be done to create a power distribution in conflict zones in the Middle East that aims to balance Saudi Arabia's interests with Iran's interests. When I finished the first 3 chapters of my book, being a humanitarian by nature, and many people advised me against doing this, I immediately sent copies of it by email to the White House when I framed the thesis of my argument and shared it with the State Department. I also shared it with colleagues in Saudi Arabia. I offered to share it with the Iranians. They were a little delayed, and when they asked for it, the copyright through the publisher had come in. But even so, I gave an interview to an Iranian press that policymakers in Iran really study. But in those 3 chapters, I had talked about the need to preserve equilibrium between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And I know that this has become a thesis of President Obama, and I don't know if my work had in any way influenced his, but of course I'd be proud if it did. But I think that President Obama has tried to establish equilibrium while at the same time being uncertain how that equilibrium should actually work out in places in Yemen. Of course, it's not straightforward, but again, the policies don't necessarily match. Jake Sullivan, who's a foreign policy advisor to Hillary Clinton, has come out and said, well, we are interested in establishing a balance in the region in favor of our allies against Iran. Again, I like to emphasize that if we want to look at a better prospect for the region, it is not balancing against Iran that should take place, but balancing with Iran that should take place. The balance between Saudi Arabia and Iran is absolutely essential in this area. So in this midst, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran really don't want to go to war with each other. They like to bring each other back in line. Iran refuses to do that because it sees its battle with the United States in terms of getting even despite the nuclear agreement. Iran always has to watch its back when it comes to managing the conflicts in the region where the United States has a major presence. Iran hopes that Saudi Arabia will come in line in managing tensions that are happening in the Islamic world. But then again, Saudi Arabia is stuck between managing its own interests between Iran and that of its allies. So here we are with these problems. And I like to just end by saying that it seems that the conflicts in the region are turning into a zero-sum game on many fronts. But I still don't see it as a zero-sum game. It is true that returning to a point of an even security line where both Saudi Arabia and Iran's security are guaranteed is getting harder and harder, given the tensions in the region. But it is possible, and Iran likes to think this, that and I believe that if we adopt policies that lead to lesser Iranian reaction, and encourage Iran to adopt a sort of a co-active power-sharing strategy with its neighbors in the region, then we can lift that sort of zero-sum game and turn it into a more positive equilibrium in the region. But if we fail to do that, then the fault lines that divide Saudi Arabia and Iran will become bigger, deeper. Religion will take on a more prominent role, and we will continue to misdirect our own thinking into thinking that the wars in the region are due to religion, whereas they're due to something else. And restoring that balance of power will become much harder. So thank you very much.
I was wondering if you could give an example of, from recent foreign policy events between the two countries, where you see that whereas the popular perception is that this Shia-Sunni divide was the reason behind this particular action, actually you read it more as you described.
Yes, there are actually plenty of examples of that. Iranian politicians have come out in numerous instances, and particularly in recent months, because they feel that Saudi Arabia is unable to contain Iran's outreach, which is not natural. Iran's outreach beyond its borders into the Arab world, as much as the Iranians like to think of it as a natural reach. And they use the Shia argument in some cases to make that case, as does the Western media. They are actually falling into an argument that's misproduced. It's wrongly produced. So Iranian politicians have come out and said, well, we understand that Saudi Arabia is trying to bring the conflict from the region into Iran. They suspect that the Saudis are behind a lot of interventions and activities and insurgencies that are rapidly shaping along the borders of Iran. But they said, we like to tell Saudi Arabia that if we wanted to disrupt your security, we could within 24 hours. But we haven't done that. They have suggested that even the Houthis in Yemen could advance farther into Saudi Arabia than they currently are trying. They do things, but they're not going. Well, this is the Iranian version. The Saudis might and rightfully disagree with a lot of this. But I think the signaling that goes out is really we don't want to get into that area with you. We really want to figure out how to live together. And if you look at Iran's actions in Yemen, Iran's actions in Syria, Iran's actions in Iraq, while Iran favorably supports the Shias, it's doing it for political reasons. And that's a very subtle issue. But it also tries to reach out to an extent to the Sunnis. So I think if the Shia-Sunni argument was the sole reason of the tensions, the region would have flared up much into fire, a full-blown fire, much more rapidly than it is now. There is a behind-the-scene management of issues, which is not always successful, but it does happen.
Please.
So thank you so much for your talk. My question would be regarding the takeaway from your talk is probably that if U.S. or the other world powers choose to disengage from the region, it would the balance of power will be a self-correcting mechanism. So my question is, has the point of no return been reached already? Do you really think that given the disengagement, it would automatically return to a balancing a stable point or not?
I struggled with your question in the conclusion of my book. And the fact is that the United States has valid interests in the region. We can't expect the United States to forgo its interests. And Iran has many problematic behaviors in the region that countries like Saudi Arabia and the United States feel that they need to confront or at least curb. So I do believe that the region has sort of reached a point of no return in many respects, that to the extent that even if the United States were to leave, we can't really understand how an equilibrium will emerge unless the tools of producing that equilibrium kick in now, while the United States remains a player, and we know that the United States won't leave the region, right? So I don't want to turn this into a circular argument. So mindful of U.S. presence in the region, again, the question is, can they restore some of that balance? And I'm not certain, because the fault lines right now are very deep. What I am certain is that if we allow these two countries to get weaker and weaker, it becomes harder and harder for them to even replenish some of the remnants of the organic self-balancing features that historically bonded them.
Please.
Could you please comment briefly on the relative freedom and political power enjoyed by women in Saudi Arabia and Iran?
Saudi Arabia and Iran have looked at each other as examples within the civil society realm. Persia, Iranians have been a role model for the region on many fronts. Saudi Arabia in the 1990s, when the relations with Iran were better, actually modeled a lot of its civil society growth based on Iran under the Khatami era. Iran had a reformist president. And a lot of discussion about the growth of women's rights, the expansion emerged then. I actually decided to write this book because I was invited to translate the discussions between the Saudi Crown Prince Abdullah bin Abdulaziz Al Saud and President Khatami. And I went in and sat there, and I was the only woman, and I was expecting the discussion to revolve around politics, Iran's nuclear issues and whatnot. And suddenly, the Crown Prince Abdullah turned to President Khatami and said, well, tell me a little bit about women's rights in Iran. And I was really, really surprised. And so the whole conversation between the two leaders for 45 minutes focused on the subject of women, and there was a little bit of subtle back and forth about, well, which country gives women more rights? It was very subtle, but it was very, and here I was, the only woman sitting there, and the irony of the exchange, of course, couldn't escape me. But luckily, I witnessed it, and I left, and I said, okay, I'm going to write this book as a woman. But going back to your question, they're really trying. They're really trying, and I myself, in the travels I had in Saudi Arabia, first of all, I've seen a progression of women's rights. Secondly, I have realized that a lot of the stereotypical views I had of women in Saudi Arabia is seriously challenged. Even if you go across the country from region to region, town to town, you see variations. They are amazingly strong and tough women, both in Iran and Saudi Arabia. That doesn't mean that women have their rights. No. But it's an uphill battle, right?
Thanks.
I hear on the radio and the television that Arabia and Saudi Arabia and Iran just need to get together and fight ISIS. And it seems to me so simple to say. And then every once in a while I hear somebody say, well, they are actually starting to do that. What's really happening?
I think that ideally what should happen is that they should think about the issue of terrorism in the region. And that is one way of turning that, sort of replenishing some of that self-balance of features, figuring out how to handle groups such as the IS in advancing their national security. What's really happening on the ground is that Iran has influence in places like Iraq, where the battle with IS is being fought. And Saudi Arabia doesn't really want to go back to the period of Iraq post-invasion in 2003, when it was unprepared, and the U.S. went unprepared, and Iran went in quite prepared to tip the balance of power in favor of itself by working with the Iraqi Shi'as. So the Saudis are like, we really all agree that we need to do something about IS, but the bigger question is the IS or is Iran the bigger threat over here? So they go back and forth between this. And ideally what should emerge is a recognition that terrorism is a threat, that states will retain national interests, and somehow they have to work together. Unfortunately, Iran is very insistent in spreading that influence again, because it doesn't think that it can sit back and depend on things being worked out on its own, or depend on Saudi Arabia or even the United States to work things out on their own in Iraq. Because if they wanted to work it out, they may have done a good job of it after Iraq was invaded in 2003. But we know that the job done was incomplete, and so Iran keeps pushing forward. I don't know if this answers your question.
Well, the question can be answered. Thank you.
Yes.
It seems like the consensus view in Saudi Arabia is that they view U.S. engagement with Iran coupled with broader U.S. disengagement from the region. They want to keep the U.S. loyal in the region and be more aggressive towards Iran by themselves as well. But how much of this is part of the power struggle within Saudi Arabia itself? So especially like Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Nayef, are they different? Is a lot of this Mohammed bin Salman trying to push his foreign policy agenda to empower himself?
My study of the Saudi-Iranian relationship sort of led me to realize that the relationship is not so much dependent on the leadership factor. The relationship is determined on structural factors that shift the imbalance of power in the region. It doesn't mean that the leadership role is non-existent or that it doesn't matter, but it can only serve to an extent in advancing the Saudi and Iranian relationship, or in stopping the progression of the Saudi and Iranian relationship. If you look at Iran's foreign policy, for example, its foreign policy doesn't dramatically shift from one president to another. Whether you have Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, a hardliner, or Mohammad Khatami, a reformer, or a conservative like President Hassan Rouhani in office, Iran's policies in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, etc., Lebanon, do not shift. And the same is also the case with Saudi Arabia, because that's how states form. and the reason of state takes over, and the leadership factor becomes a subcategory of the reason of state, the security of the state, the need to advance that state. I think that Iran in its analysis, and Saudi Arabia as well, they haven't done enough to understand each other, and oftentimes they like to fault the leadership, especially now in Saudi Arabia, for the tensions. But I think that's a way of brushing over some of the real structural factors and problems that Iran and Saudi Arabia are involved in.
Should Turkey be brought into the equation?
Both Iran and Saudi Arabia like to bring Turkey into the equation in their own favor. But if Turkey is able to develop a balanced relationship with both simultaneously, then I believe that Turkey can have a tremendous influence in helping the two countries restore some of the balance between them. I believe that Turkey does want to do that because Turkey has its own interests, and its interests lie in, first of all, a safe and secure region, safe and secure borders in the Kurdish zones of the region, and safe and secure economy. The Iranian market, the Saudi market is of tremendous value to Turkey.
In the back.
Going back to the question about the tipping point, the weapons that the United States continually sells to the Saudis, and this being viewed by the Iranians as provocation, the fact that the Saudis also are exploring developing a nuclear power in terms of reactors that they're purchasing, and the Israeli press reporting that there has been outreach between the Israelis and the Saudis, it would appear that the tipping point has passed.
The tipping point, in my view, is not dependent on the sale of weapons, although obviously the sale of weapons exacerbates the asymmetrical power structure, Iran's asymmetrical power and capabilities, because Iran has no way of matching those weapons capabilities, and so it resorts to other means to contain, and deter in the region. The tipping point in the Saudi-Iranian relationship is a simple issue. Will contain the cost of containing, if the cost of containing Iran far outweighs the cost of engaging with it, then Saudi Arabia and Iran will try to live with each other to an extent, maybe with undercurrents of unease. But if the cost of engaging Iran outweighs the cost of undercutting Iran, then Saudi Arabia will go ahead and undercut Iran.
Let's see. Yeah.
If I may follow up on that question, the Saudis have threatened to do something to the U.S. when the U.S. Congress made a resolution condemning Saudis for the role in 9/11. Congress did pass that resolution. What have the Saudis done so far?
The Saudi-U.S. interests are historic, they are deep. As my understanding of that resolution is that the case has to be made. It's not just a case has to be made that the Saudi government was involved, and when that case is made, then of course reparations can be sought. I think that there are many voices in both Saudi Arabia and Iran that challenge the content of the resolution, because it goes back to the humanitarian discussion I had earlier. While I think it is necessary to seek justice, it's also necessary to be mindful of not isolating either Saudi Arabia or Iran too much for geostrategic reasons, because geostrategically we need to learn to depend on both countries to fix some of the problems of the region. And this ties into your question of military arms sales. Against this backdrop, you might be interested to know, a trend is emerging, has emerged for a long time since the Gulf War, in both Saudi Arabia and Iran, of developing an indigenous military capability. And while Iran has been forced to develop that because it certainly is not in a position of buying arms from international markets, to the extent that Saudi Arabia is, each time these tensions arise with the United States, there's a big voice in Saudi Arabia that comes out and says, we need to rely on ourselves as well. And if you look, the Saudis are also trying to work with the UAE, the other Gulf Cooperation Council, Arab states, to develop military maneuvers. And these are all examples, again, when the Saudis think of balancing against Iran. When I shared the content of my work with them, they came out and said, well, we need to balance against Iran. It's fine to do all of that, to develop indigenous military capabilities, to have military maneuvers, as long as the purpose is to balance with. So I hope this answers some of the question.
Please.
I hope I can get this out, but I'm not sure. It's a little non-conventional. I understand the language of the field and the language of historians and political scientists. And sometimes you get bogged down in all that knowledge and no answer comes out. And I'm a scientist, and I think in a different vein. And I just wanted to present something to see where it fits in. I think there's something that is not used at all, that's at the heart of it, that if it was put into use, it would solve it all. Now, a few days ago, we went to a lecture by a Nobel Prize economics professor.
Sir,
yes.
really, could you?
Yes.
Thank you.
And the question is how to develop a nation to ignore these problems, ignore these interactions, but burst their nation into society, explode economically, so that the people who are free of agriculture and this had something to do rather than maybe attacking another nation or something like that. And presently we have three modes of attack in the world, I see. One, classical ethical attack, way of doing things, religious or classical ethical. Two, you do what's legal. And the third, you do what you get away with. And there's a fourth that can be used right now, but unfortunately it may come up only in 500 years from now. That is right in front of us. As a scientist, the laws of science...
Sir, excuse me, could you ask the question?
Okay, the
Thank
question
you.
the one law of science is central, and it applies to humans, and it's not applied. That's the law of thermodynamics. Things are bad if you increase entropy. Things are good if you decrease energy or foster love and decrease hatred. Right out of physics and right out of the laws that we all follow.
Can I interrupt and say something here? The arguments that I make here go beyond the nature of regimes. Trust me when I tell you that. This is not about just the Islamic Republic of Iran or the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Even, and I don't like to use the word regime, so I hope that you forgive me for using it, but I'm just talking about a political economic process and therefore regime. Even if these regimes were to change, the undercurrents of religion, the undercurrents of some of the issues you talk about, the population issues, the youth issues, will remain. And religion, being the easiest form of fallback, will continue to shape how they interact with one another. So even if we had, which is an anomaly of history, supposedly a pro-Saudi government in Iran in a scenario that's envisioned that doesn't take away from the fact that the undercurrents of religion will remain. You may know that religion expands, religion grows very quickly. It's some of the people who've opted to volunteer from Iran and Syria, according to the Iranian government, receive only $100 a month as a salary to go and protect some of the Shia holy sites. And so this religion will tie into the narrative of the end of the world. Syria, Israel, the end of the world narrative will bring them together. And so we come back and we look at Saudi Arabia and at Iran. And the key question again is, how do they manage this? Even if it's the end of the world, how will they better manage the end of the world? So I don't think we can have a decisive answer to anything. We can only look at the structural shifts of power and try to manage it preferentially in a better way.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Yes, I look forward to reading your book. It sounds very interesting. And just a quick question. What forces in both Iran and Saudi Arabia and other countries, maybe Turkey or Oman, because what forces in these countries are working towards your vision of re-establishing a balance now, not depending on a history of balance,
Yes.
but now,
Yes.
what forces?
There is a natural force, and that is the fact that within the Gulf Cooperation Council, besides Saudi Arabia being the largest country, in some ways the wealthier, although the UAE now is extremely wealthy. But because of the fact that these other 5 countries, Bahrain, Kuwait, UAE, Oman, are smaller countries, territorially compared with Iran, they historically are not really in favor of an outright direct war with Iran. Even if you look at the history of the Iran-Iraq War, while they at key points funded Iraq, they were also all pursuing indirect negotiations with Iran, or sometimes, direct negotiations privately with Iran. So there is some hope that that organic self-balancing feature has because they understand the cost of going to war with each other very well. So let's hope that that keeps building up.
We have time for one last. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for a very well-balanced and even-handed conversation about Iran. It's been refreshing. I haven't heard one in a long time like this. So the quick question is, and there's a little pushback, because if you go back to the pictures, Shah of Iran and King Faisal kissing each other, hugging each other, same with Saddam Hussein, same with all of these Arab leaders. So you get the sense that there was no Shia-Sunni conflict at that time, because if that was the case, there would have been no hugging and kissing going on. And so that brings the next question of the arsonist role of the Saudi Arabia, which was covered in the New York Times a few weeks ago, that the Saudis continue to push this narrative that there's a conflict that exists between the Sunni and the Shias. And perhaps Iran also plays their hand into it. But so where does this thing, how does everybody outside come back to them and say, well, look, calm down, guys. You are trying to blow this up into a Sunni-Shia conflict across the Muslim lands when none needs to exist and none existed. So what should be the narrative of everybody else to help them out of this mess?
If you look at the official statements of Saudis, they actually dismiss the Shia-Sunni divide. They never frame the conflicts with Iran in that manner, because they're very mindful that the region could fall back into the time when Saddam tried to use this issue in favor of Iraqi expansionism. They do fault Iran for promoting what they call sectarianism. And that often happens when Saudi Arabia feels that it's at a disadvantage. So I would be very hesitant to say that the Shia-Sunni debate has taken center stage in how the two countries ought to work with each other or not. In fact, it's whenever I open the newspapers here in the United States that I get frightened by the level of Shia-Sunni discord arguments that go on. And if you look, this picked up right after the invasion of Iraq. Nobody was talking about the Shia-Sunnis before the invasion. So Saudi Arabia did not invade Iraq. Iran did not invade Iraq. It was the United States that went in, correct? And I wonder if that is also a way of saying, hey, we're not responsible for this. The region had its own problems. So I think that a certain degree of responsibility and accountability should go hand in hand to redress the extent that the Shia-Sunni divide is actually driving the tensions or not.
Thank you very, very much for